Okay, so the historical movement of gender egalitarianism, or lack thereof, is rampant with examples which attest to the truth of these assertions. These are particularly potent in cultures such as the Jewish and Greek, where the folk observances and traditions of the pastoral and agrarian people have been watched over by the domineering eye of the patriarchate since they settled Goshen, which is Lower Egypt, and Greece proper, respectively. During the classical period of Hellenic history, a time heeded by many present-day romanticists to have been a golden age embodiment of utopian ideals, women were without voting rights or financial independence, and were precluded from intellectual endeavours of any sort or flavour. Similar values flourished in Hebrew culture, where chastity and virginal purity were foremost of the virtues comprising a woman's candidature to marry. In addition to this, her ability to obtain a divorce was precariously hinged on her husband's consent. It goes without saying that the same limitations did not extend to men, who enjoyed lives that were far less regimented and more variegated by comparison. When imperial Rome came to the forefront under the genius of Julius Caesar by conquering territories that were held by the aforementioned cultures, it inherited the pejorative Iron Age attitudes towards women that had been prevalent there for centuries on end, and facilitated their diffusion across the globe. To give an example, most Greeks today remain faithful to traditional patrilineal values, where both the female partner and the children born to a married couple inherit the paternal surname. This shouldn't come as any great surprise, seeing that as late as the 1800s, it was a widely held belief that semen, the active male seed, was itself the unripened being that developed into a human baby after being planted inside the female, who merely provided the womb. In other words, the male role in procreation was perceived as vastly superior to that of the female. Much more worrisome and arguably of greater concern is its potency in having infected the greatest intellectuals to have graced the planet. Aristotle himself, foremost of the peripatetic school of classical philosophy, succumbed to the quixotic appeal of the patriarchal and orthodox syllogism. Even language reflects a bias and appreciation for the masculine sex, as exemplified in biblical scripture. Ishash in Hebrew is the word for woman, and means taken out of man, recalling the patriarchal idea that the female is a smaller and much lower aspect of a male equivalent which came first. The unjust dichotomy between what is in truth two equal parts of a whole also dribbled into the Old English language, and found life in woman, a word which translates to wife to man, and insolently immortalizes the exact same sentiment. It's rather disconcerting that such tragic consequences can ensue from such banal mythographical detail, yet here it is, palpably exposed in the historical exposition of a gender equity movement where the scales are rigorously tipped in the male's favour. The irony at the heart of the misogynistic affair is that the details concerning Eve's creation as a woman, fashioned from a man's rib, isn't really any original product of a clever and inventive mind, but rather a pejorative inversion of a far older Sumerian myth involving the mother goddess Ninhursag and her god-child Enki. In this melodramatic encounter, Enki is reproached by his mother for the incestuous act of raping his own daughters. The potency of her curse is such that he develops a grave illness characterized by sudden deterioration of body parts. One of the first to undergo necrosis is his rib. In the Sumerian language, the word ti, can denote either rib or the act of bringing something to life. When Ninhursag lays eyes upon her dying son, her maternal instincts return, and she quickly reverses the effects of her evil incantation by bringing forth Ninti, a goddess whose magical powers successfully regenerate Enki's necrotic rib. Here, the act of healing a rib and the act of giving birth are equated in Ninti, a goddess whose name literally means the lady of the rib, but also the lady who makes live. So in picking apart the Sumerian myth, we catch glimpses of a matriarchal reckoning of the cosmos illuminated through an archaic literary pun which links the idea of the goddess or woman, the rib or bone, birth, rebirth, and regeneration. The writers who composed the book of Genesis in the Hebrew language retained the rib symbolism in Yahweh's creation of Eve, But the meaningful nexus that the Sumerian root words had illuminated between Eve, the new mother of all living things, and the rib as an implement of birth was lost in translation. The ultimate betrayal of women and her primeval guise as serpent comes in the latter part of the Genesis creation account, when the mythographers implicate both as bringers of death and the sole reason for all humanity and nature to inherit ancestral sin and become fallen and accursed. In establishing his marked or cosmic order, Yahweh had made it clear that his majestic and enchanting garden was not open to interrogation by any of his minions per se. Curiosity or any digression from his spoken words constituted sin, a lust of the eyes, as 4th century theologian St. Augustine put it. In the minds of our patriarchal forefathers, it made perfect sense as to why Eve betrayed the divine command not to eat of the forbidden fruit, hanging off the branches of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which stood at the center of paradise. Eve was a woman, and being the product of a divine cogitation, deemed evolutionarily lower than that of man, she was much less disciplined, scrupulously moral, and credulous than he. Hence, she was far more likely to believe fibs told by a devious and evil serpent, and succumb to temptations that inevitably drove a permanent wedge between God and the most favoured of his creatures. Eve's betrayal of the divine instigated a fall which drew to herself, to Adam, and to humanity as a whole a tragic condition of mortality marked by suffering, travail, and the inevitability of death. Because before that there was no death. The collective exoteric mind, generally speaking, is gullible, superstitious, and more or less ignorant. So when these details of the Genesis myth entered consciousness, they began to modify the cultural terrain of antiquity in a way that made it easy for the likes of Apostle Paul, St. Augustine of Hippo, and other early church fathers to freely express their own chauvinistic attitudes against women and promote gender inequality without the threat of any reprimand. And on that note, I will see you next time.